In this video, I will be attempting to survive 100 days in Saskatchewan in hardcore Minecraft. This means I'll have to survive the extreme cold, aggressive wildlife, and the Canadian folklore that I'll find here, all while I build myself a base for survival and explore Canada's untouched province. So with that being said, let's get started. I spawned in a forest, and quickly saw that I was not alone. Well, hello there. I don't actually want to try and eat you, because I feel like you're gonna fight back. Yeah, I'm definitely not gonna try to eat you. I decided that these berries would probably be my best bet for food right now. I also went ahead and started collecting some wood, which I then used to craft a pickaxe. And I used that to collect cobblestone. As I went to leave the area, I heard a really creepy noise. So I went in the opposite direction and headed further into the woods. My objective now is to craft a bed, or maybe even find one in a structure. However, I didn't find any structures today. In fact, I just ended up walking through the woods for the rest of the day. And before I knew it, the sun had already begun to set. So, with no other option, I began to burrow down. As I mine my way into the Canadian shield, I'll go ahead and turn up the brightness so you can see while I'm underground. And that way, you can watch as I begin to freeze. Yeah, I had no idea what to do here, as I didn't have any wool clothes or lanterns. So I did the only thing I could do, and that was just mine straight down. Eventually, this worked, but at the cost of some health. Either way, I spent the rest of the night mining, and I ended up finding one piece of iron, which I smelted and used to craft flint and steel, so I wouldn't freeze again. Soon enough, the sun rose on the Canadian wilderness. I started to make my way back up to the surface, and on the way, I found some coal. From there, I finally resurfaced, and decided to head east. As I did, I soon encountered more of the howling creatures from earlier, and one started to chase me. I was able to outrun it, and then I realized that these were coyotes. So yeah, I just continued east. Soon enough, I ended up in this marshy area. So, I figured it'd be smart for me to tower up and take a look around. But I didn't see anything from up here. However, after a bit of tree jumping, I did actually spot something. I headed towards the glimpse of a building, and saw that it was a cabin of sorts. Oh, and there was a lot of wildlife around it, including this large animal that started charging right at me. I ended up leading it around the building, and eventually lost it. I then saw this snake, which prompted me to go ahead and enter the building. The cabin was definitely occupied, which meant that there had to be a bed. And there was. I then went outside and stole some lanterns as the sun began to set. On day 3, I woke up and headed further east into the woods. At this point, I was really low from walking into the berry bushes, and I needed water badly. Yeah, I was not in a good spot here. So as I walked further and further east, I did so slowly, as I could not afford to lose any more health. I made some towers here and there, but it wasn't until I made this tower later in the day that I saw exactly what I was looking for: water. So I headed right for it, and soon found myself at a rather scenic lake. I went ahead and collected some sand, before then smelting it, and using the glass to craft water bottles. And even though the water wasn't entirely clean, I was still able to heal back up again. I then went ahead and crafted a boat, before rowing out into the lake. And yeah, the scenery really was amazing. Only it wasn't until I rowed over to this island that I realized where I was. as this lake seemed to have tons of islands, and it was relatively close to where I spawned. That meant it had to be Reindeer Lake. Reindeer Lake. At over 2,500 square miles, or 6,600 square kilometers, this huge lake sits in the northeast of Saskatchewan, and even enters into western Manitoba, which is the Canadian province just east of here. Regardless, this lake is not only dotted with over 5,000 islands, but it's also a great place to find huge fish, like lake trout or pike. But this is also where I want to mention that the research for this video would not be possible without a very special guest collaborator. Mikey Helton was one of the top 3 contestants on the 10th season of the show alone, where he survived right here in Reindeer Lake on his own for 55 days. I can't even begin to describe how impressive that is, and he was kind enough to reach out and offer his help in accurately capturing Reindeer Lake. So I want to give a huge thanks to Mikey, and we will definitely be discussing him more later. But for now, I wanted to find a place to start building my base at. As the afternoon set in, I found this grassy area, which seemed perfect. So I got to clearing it. And the next day, I started collecting wood, which I then used to make the outline for my base. I want to make a big rustic barn with a properly working farm around it. So yes, this is my very first farm base. But for right now, I just want to get the outline done, as I had some objectives to complete for this video. See, Saskatchewan is an often overlooked province of Canada, and while it has plenty of wonders and landmarks that I'll be exploring, it really shines in its wildlife. So for this video, I will be photographing 5 of Saskatchewan's most vulnerable or endangered animals. Oh, and as a little side objective, I've heard rumors of a lake monster that lives within Saskatchewan's Turtle Lake. So I'll also be trying to investigate that. But with that being said, I ended up finishing most of the main barn's outline today. But as I built across the top here, I accidentally hit space and had this happen. Yeah, I not only almost died there, but I also didn't have any food to heal with. So I went out to try and kill some fish. I saw this massive fish in the lake and decided not to mess with it, as I can't risk my health right now. So instead, I went for these minnows, which weren't helpful at all. So on day 5, I knew I had to go hunting. This was dangerous though, as I was one mistake away from dying. So I decided to eat some berries on the way. But I really needed something more substantial. I soon entered this open area, right as a thunderstorm began. And, after searching for most of the day, I finally heard something near these ponds. I soon saw the source, and quickly killed it. As it turns out, I had found a grouse, which meat-wise is kinda like chicken. So I took my cooked grouse and ate it, before deciding to head home to finish up my base outline. Next day, I built up the outline of this side cabin, but then I remembered that I had to craft a camera for this video. So I went to look at the crafting recipe. And yeah, it involved redstone and a lot of iron, neither of which I had. So I got right to mining. Only I found nothing but coal all day. But despite that, next morning I decided that I had to start heading to my first location anyways. Yeah, I could only hope that I'd find some iron and redstone along the way. Regardless, the first animal that I'll be looking for is the plains bison, which I will find in the Grasslands National Park. And that is all the way down here, near the border of Saskatchewan and Montana. So yeah, I had a long ways to go, but luckily for me, this lake filters out into a river that heads south, called Reindeer River. So I rode my way south for the rest of the day. This river then ended up filtering into another river that no longer headed south. In fact, this river was pretty big, and with my knowledge of Saskatchewan, I knew that this had to be the Churchill River, an almost 1,000 mile or 1,600 kilometer long river that eventually leads into the Hudson Bay. But my fascinating river facts came to a pause when I saw some wildlife along the river banks. As I got closer, I saw that these were pine martens, And yes, this would absolutely be my companion for the video. I didn't have a lead yet, so I just got one into my boat, before then continuing along the river for a bit. That same afternoon, I found another waterway that headed south. Next morning, I eventually decided to pull over and try my luck again with mining. After all, I really needed to craft that camera. Only when I went to disembark, I saw some large animals ahead. As it turns out, there was a black bear and a cub. Yeah, I knew that I needed to get away from the cub fast. So I did just that, and mined over here instead. I should honestly thank the bears though, as I ended up finding iron pretty quickly. But this was nothing compared to what I found later in the day. Yeah, like, look at this. I easily have more than enough iron now. From here, I went ahead and crafted both a knife and an iron pickaxe. Now I just needed the redstone for the camera, but I'll try and find that later, because on day 10, I went ahead and resurfaced. Before then collecting some straw. I used this straw to craft a lead for Martin. Anyways, I ended up accidentally hitting Martin as I went to destroy the boat. And funnily enough, he can get aggressive. So yeah, he just started attacking me. And I couldn't even attach him to the lead. So another option, I just put him in the boat. I knew I'd have to return here later to bring him back to my base, but honestly that's okay, because now I was able to properly head into the woods. And this is where I would remain for the next few days. Yeah, I walked through the endless trees, and eventually the Canadian Shield disappeared from beneath me. And for those of you who don't know, the Canadian Shield is a massive stretch of rock that covers a lot of Canada. But for the purposes of this video, you just need to know that it covers most of northern Saskatchewan. Rocks aside, I did more mining over these days, and I finally did find some redstone. And so, on day 13, as I found myself at the edge of this river, I decided to go ahead and craft the camera. Now I just needed paper for the photos. So, I made a cutting board, and started stripping bark from these logs. Now with my paper crafted, it was time to test it out. Yes, look at my incredible photography skills. Anyways, with my camera now crafted, I just continued further south down this river. Next morning, I saw some more coyotes over by the riverside, and I got a little bit closer to them this time. For some reason, they weren't hostile with me here, but they definitely were earlier, so yeah, I didn't really know what their deal was. However, that soon left my mind, as the river I was traveling on led me into a much different area. I had to be rowing through southern Saskatchewan now, because I had just entered the prairie. This also meant that I had a whole new ecosystem of animals to watch out for. I decided to experience this firsthand when I left the river and headed out into the grassy plains before me. As I walked around, the atmosphere was definitely different. But I didn't see any wildlife today. No, I just continued south into day 15, where I could only hope that I was getting close to the Grasslands National Park. I did notice that I was starting to run out of food though, and that was definitely concerning, as I didn't see any wildlife at all. I kept trekking through the infinite grassy landscape, even into the afternoon. However, this is where I noticed that the grass had taken on a different color, and the atmosphere had once again changed. But it wasn't until I saw this mesa that I could confirm just where I was. The Grasslands National Park, a seemingly endless expanse of grassy hills and jutting mesas. This fairly new national park was established in 1981 in order to protect the unique wildlife and scenery of the area. And thanks to its remoteness, this park is one of the best dark sky preserves in the world, meaning that it's the perfect place to see the entire night sky. This national park really does offer an amazing look at Canada's most overlooked province. I climbed up the mesa as the sun began to set. As I did, I saw 2 separate rattlesnakes. So yeah, that's something I'll have to keep an eye out for. Next morning, I woke up on top of the mesa and realized that I didn't have any more food. Yeah, I had now resorted to killing flies for food, which is not at all ideal. I really wanted to find a bison soon, as I need to get back up to the forest where there was more wildlife. Only as I headed out into the grasslands, I heard something behind me. Yeah, here was yet another snake. So I kept my distance, and just continued into this yellow field, which just so happened to have wheat. I collected some and immediately crafted bread. So now I had my food taken care of, but I still hadn't seen a bison yet. I searched the grasslands all day long, but it wasn't until that very evening that I would find what I was looking for. I got my camera out and tried to get some pictures, but some of the bison ended up fighting with each other, and then one decided to charge right at me. Yeah, it was kinda hard to get a good picture. But the next morning, I woke up and took a look at the pictures that I had managed to take. Only one of them was even passable, and I was out of paper, so it's not like I could take any more. But from here, I decided to spend some time with them, before beginning my journey back north. Only centuries ago, these very grassy plains were overflowing with populations of the plains bison. They were only hunted by the various indigenous groups in the region, but as European settlement progressed, the bison of the Great Plains were soon discovered by the settlers, and that led to an extreme wave of overhunting, leaving the plains bison almost extinct. It wasn't until 2005 that the Grasslands National Park reintroduced the plains bison back into their natural habitat, or more appropriately, their home. Today in Saskatchewan, these bison are listed as at risk, but at least progress has been made in bringing these animals back to their home. I headed northwest rather than northeast, as I wanted to stop by Turtle Lake and see what this lake monster was all about. Now, Turtle Lake is in the western central part of Saskatchewan, meaning that I probably wasn't too far from it. But that didn't mean that this would be a quick trip, because I was already saving my sprint since I was out of water. But this issue was resolved the next morning when I found a river. I drank some water and then rode across the river, continuing northwest. However, later that same day, I saw a structure, and this one looked to be a farmhouse. Only an abandoned one. I went to explore it, but as I did, I got bitten. I quickly built up and saw this rattlesnake, and yeah, I'm lucky that it didn't bite me more than once, but we'll certainly be talking more about them later. Anyways, once it had left, I got down from my tower and took a look in the farmhouse. There wasn't really much in here, but I did build up onto the rafters and see this chest. Inside was some fine loot, mostly a lot of coal and this stew. Oh, and a lot of string, which will actually be helpful when I go to craft a fishing rod. Anyways, I decided to stay here for the night. On day 19, I went to explore the silo before leaving. Only as I opened up the top of it, I fell in and immediately started suffocating. Yeah, this was not a good idea. Now I was very low and didn't have any food to heal. So with no other option, I just continued northwest. But on a good note, the stew that I had taken from the house actually ended up giving me a healing effect. So today wasn't all bad. Yet as I continued through this forested area the next day, I saw some movement in the grass ahead. Yes, there were deer before me, and I knew that I needed the food. So, it was time to do some hunting. I tried going straight after one, but it was definitely faster than me. To be fair, I couldn't even sprint, so instead, I tried putting my boat down to trap it. But that didn't work either. I did eventually manage to get a few hits on this deer, but that resulted in it charging right at me. Luckily, I was able to kill it before it reached me. So from there, I put the meat in my furnace and then ate the cooked venison. Now I was able to continue my trip at a much faster pace. And with that being said, I had actually reached the forest again by that afternoon. And as the sun began to set, I saw water in the distance. Now I didn't know if this was Turtle Lake or not, but I did know that there was one way to find out, as I crafted a fishing rod. I rode out into the middle of the lake the next morning. And from here, I decided to swim down to take a look. This reminded me a lot of my time in Scotland. Anyways, I didn't see anything, so I swam back up and decided to do some fishing. I caught a few fish and then headed back to cook them. And on the morning of day 22, I rode out into a different part of the lake to take another look. But yeah, no luck. Then I remembered that I could just use doors. So I headed over to the woods and crafted some doors. Then I headed back out and decided to test it. Only I had forgotten just how creepy this was. I went to place another door further away, and that's when I finally saw something. So I quickly placed a door. And then, unfortunately for me, it entered. I swam up immediately, and this is when I got my first glimpse of the Turtle Lake monster. I headed straight for the shore, and it followed right behind me. Like, literally right behind me. Ooh, okay. Eventually, I reached the shore and got away from it. I decided to use this opportunity to try and fish it, but I didn't have any luck. I knew that I had to get to the other side of the lake to continue home, so I decided to tower up and jump back in. It continued to tail me, but this time, it also began dealing damage to me. And then I started to drown. So I headed back up to the surface and made it to the shore. From here, I just ran through the woods for a while. The Turtle Lake monster is a large anomalous monster that is rumored to live within Saskatchewan's Turtle Lake. Reports measure it up to 30 feet in length, and one theory suggests that it's just an abnormally large sturgeon. But local legend says otherwise. The next day, I ended up walking far through a forest before I found this river, where I did some fishing through the evening. This is when I remembered that I still had to pick up Martin on the way back home. So on day 24, I continued through the forests and spent my entire day doing that. I really underestimated just how big Saskatchewan is, as in reality, it's larger than California, but it only has a population of 1.2 million, compared to California's 39 million. Nothing else really happened until day 25, when I reached another lake. And as I rode around, I finally found Martin again. And luckily, he's no longer mad at me. So from there, we rode north towards the Churchill River. Only I ended up seeing a really nice cabin that afternoon. As I approached the cabin the next morning, I was in for quite a surprise, because I really did not expect this one to be an outpost. But I went ahead and destroyed this spawner before heading inside. I also crafted a shield and took whatever loot that I could find, which was mostly food. I didn't really want to fight them right now, but I did end up getting shot by this guy. After collecting enough wood, I then continued east into the Churchill River. I rode for almost the entire day, until I finally reached my home that afternoon. Yeah, I definitely had some work to do. I did as much wood collecting as I could before the sun set. And the next morning, I chopped a lot more wood. It began to storm, but I just kept chopping. Now, all of you know that surviving in Minecraft is very different from real life. Like, I obviously wouldn't be able to build this barn from scratch if I was dropped in the middle of Reindeer Lake. Now, Mikey and I weren't able to get an image of his shelter from alone, but he did tell me that he used materials like driftwood, moss, and black spruce. He also had the opportunity to speak with the indigenous Cree of Saskatchewan, and we will certainly be talking more about them later. But for now, I had to keep building my barn, and I ended up getting a lot of progress done by the end of the day. Next morning, I finished the walls, and then started right on the floor. I spent the whole day doing this, but I did have to stop to watch this sunset. Before then finishing the floors on day 30, I then turned my attention to the cabin. I also started on the actual farm part around the barn, and had to mine through the rocky shield covering the ground. Anyways, while I do this, I'll go ahead and reveal the next animal on my list, and that is the Wolverine, which I will find up near the Athabasca sand dunes. I decided that day 31 would be my last day of base work for now, so I used it to shape the farm into a large circle around my barn. And then I did some fishing to end the day. Next morning, I set out to find the Wolverine. Now, I knew that the Athabasca sand dunes were northwest of here, and they weren't too far away. So, I took Reindeer Lake north, before then disembarking and heading west by foot. Only I was soon reminded to take this journey with caution, as I came across a black bear and some coyotes. Regardless, I continued northwest, while also thinking about how best to capture the Turtle Lake monster. However, that was soon the least of my concerns. Yeah, this was bad. A snow and hailstorm had completely come out of nowhere, and I was not prepared. I was out of water and could start freezing at any moment. I slowly made my way through the forest against the harsh winds. Luckily for me, I reached another lake and was able to refill my water. As I did, I lit some contained fires in order to keep me warm. And then I set off across the lake through the violent storm. By the next morning, the storm had mostly passed. I went ahead and crafted myself some iron armor, as I had a feeling that I'd be coming across some more wildlife. So I headed further into the woods. And the only wildlife that I did end up seeing today was this coyote. But once again, it wasn't hostile with me. In fact, I got a little advancement. Anyways, that same afternoon, I found this river. And knowing that I had to be near the dunes, I took the river north. The next morning, as I continued up the river, I saw the trees begin to disappear on either side of me. And I was quite happy to see that they were being replaced with sand. The Athabasca sand dunes, a seemingly out-of-place wonder among the forested wetlands surrounding it. These sand dunes can reach as high as 30 meters, or almost 100 feet. They also make up the largest active sand surface in all of Canada, and are some of the northernmost active sand dunes in the world. Dating back around 8,000 years, the Athabasca sand dunes were formed in the last glacial period, as the adjacent Lake Athabasca used to be much larger. But when the water level lowered, wind shaped these dunes into what they are now. I explored the dunes for a while and walked up and over a few of them. But having just crossed the Sahara in my last video, I decided to make my visit brief. After all, I had a Wolverine to find. So I entered Lake Athabasca and eventually pulled over to make some paper. As I did, I saw some moose locking antlers. I went ahead and placed down my cutting board, before collecting some wood and stripping it for bark. Then I crafted a decent amount of paper, and I knew that I was now ready to find the Wolverine. So I headed right into the forest that evening, but I almost ran into this bear. Next morning, I continued my search for a Wolverine by rowing around the perimeter of the lake. But instead of a Wolverine, I just found a hillside with a couple of boars on it, and I knew that I could definitely use the food. So I went right in and attacked one. And of course, it attacked me right back. This one didn't even drop any meat, which is pretty frustrating. So I went to attack another one. And this one almost killed me. Oh, okay, you're not worth it. You're not worth it. Yeah, I immediately swam out into the lake to get away. That was way too close. In order to heal back up, I had to do some fishing. The next morning, now fully healed, I searched this rocky area nearby. As I looked around the area, I was suddenly really confused by the appearance of a small white-haired creature. Well, there were actually a few of them, just kind of zooming around. Yeah, I really had no idea what was going on, but when I approached this one, it teleported me instead. Oh, what was that? You're weird. So I decided to keep moving, as when it comes to folklore, I always want to play it safe. Anyways, after seeing some skunks that afternoon, I ended up hearing some distinct growling. And when I went to investigate it, I was met with this brown-furred animal charging right at me. There was no doubt in my mind that this was a Wolverine, but my camera quest was sidetracked for now, as I had to run. I ran out into this rocky area, before then turning around and attempting to get a clear picture of it. And that's when I almost died yet again. I immediately escaped from the Wolverine and headed right for the shore. On the verge of death, I was able to reach the lake and heal up again. As I did, I also took a look at my picture. It's a pretty funny picture. I made my way home over the next few days and experience some more snow. While I travel, let's go ahead and discuss the animal that I just encountered. Wolverines are known to be some of the fiercest animals in both North America and Eurasia, as they can take down predators over twice their size. That's because they're skilled fighters and also strong swimmers. But despite their tenacity, the North American Wolverine population is in decline. And here in Saskatchewan, they're listed as a special concern. These guys are slowly disappearing from the northern forests. But thanks to their legal protections, some work is being done on their population. I made it home midday on day 42, and got right to work on the farm. I put some slabs around the exterior, and then this wandering trader showed up. I decided to actually treat him normally for once, and I bought these 2 water lilies. Then after tucking him in for bedtime, I started on the waterway the next morning. After all, I'd need the water to reach the crops somehow. My progress was slowed though, when a pretty bad snowstorm came through that evening. Yeah, it just made it really hard to see what I was doing. And there was another one the next day. I was starting to get concerned that winter was on the way, as the lake was also starting to freeze over on the edges. Despite my concerns, I was able to finish up the water path today. And besides, the next animal on my list is much further south. Next up, I'll be finding the Burrowing Owl near the Cypress Hills. But before I embark on that journey, I had a new problem to fix, as the water was already freezing over in my farm. So the next morning, I decided to solve that problem by making some campfires. Now, these weren't exactly easy to fit in with the rest of the scenery, but I think I did a decent job. I then began to prep the soil for the seeds that I'd plant just a moment later. I can only plant them in the front of my farm, as these were the only spots that were warm enough. But that soon didn't matter, because on day 46, I set off for the Cypress Hills. Now, the Cypress Hills Park is located in Saskatchewan's southwestern corner. So yeah, I had a bit of traveling to do. Luckily for me, I knew the right route to take. As I headed south down Reindeer Lake, and then headed west across the Churchill River. And the next morning, I disembarked and walked south through the forest. This was some really tedious travel though. But it did pay off, as I found a piece of Saskatchewan's folklore that very night. See, I came across this lake, and I figured that it was just a normal lake, until I saw these lights. This made it clear to me that I was experiencing the spectral phenomenon of Candle Lake. Many years ago, these woods were occupied by the indigenous Cree people, and according to the Saskatchewan archives, the very name for this lake is derived from the Cree natives, as Candle Lake is appropriately named after these legendary lights that sometimes appear on the north end of the lake, near some Cree graves. Now, we'll definitely be discussing the Woodland and Plains Cree again later, but these glowing lights sit as a silent reminder of Saskatchewan's past. I continued south through the entirety of day 48, and with nothing eventful going on, I made it to the prairie that evening. Next day, I took this river further south towards the Grasslands, which I reached that very afternoon. From here, I turned west, and found a forest much faster than I had anticipated. Only I did have one problem now. I was out of food. So as I progressed through the forest the next morning, I looked around for anything edible. And that's when I heard a noise. I quickly killed this grouse and cooked it, before then eating it and continuing onward. But I was unaware of the fact that I was not the only one hunting in the area. This cougar had come out of nowhere and just kept chasing me. So I quickly equipped my shield just in time to block some incoming attacks. From there, I just kept running, until it decided that it was no longer interested. So I quietly took out my camera and had a closer look at it. I then just continued through the forest into the evening. However, the next morning, as I climbed this hill and took a look around me, I realized that I was already in the Cypress Hills Interprovincial Park. The Cypress Hills, stretching across both Saskatchewan and its provincial neighbor to the west, Alberta, the Cypress Hills Interprovincial Park is home to the highest point of Saskatchewan, right at 1,300 meters, or 4,500 feet. This geological wonder is unique due to its scenic rolling hills that are dotted with forestry, almost reminiscent of the landscape back in my Scotland video. Here you can also find a population of cougars, as well as plenty of other wildlife within this subarctic climate. I walked up and over this hill before heading back into the nearby forest. This is where I ended up seeing a commotion in the distance, and upon investigating it, I found a herd of deer being attacked by some cougars. Only then, one of the cougars turned its attention to me. So I ran, until I couldn't. Yeah, I towered up just in time. And from here, all I could do was walk along the trees, as I had no food at all. The cougar just followed me everywhere I went, so I decided that I had to do what I had to do in order to survive. Yeah, I killed it and collected some meat, before then killing this deer nearby. I also collected a lot of meat that was just on the ground, so yeah, I'm about to have a proper cookout. I put the cougar meat in my furnace first, but then when I went to eat it, I got terribly sick. I should have known not to eat the cougar. This is really not good. This brought me all the way down to half a heart. So yeah, I immediately threw out the rest of the cougar meat, and had to eat some cooked venison to heal back up. After that lovely experience, I then headed east the next day, as I knew that the burrowing owl would be found closer to the Grasslands National Park. As I headed into the Grasslands, I realized that it must be a hot day today, as I soon began to overheat. I quickly placed my water down and cooled off, but I didn't want to have to continue doing this as I walked, so I just went back and sheared some leaves, which I used to craft leaf armor. Now I could traverse the grasslands freely. I kept an eye out for burrows, but I didn't see any today. Next morning, I decided to try a different strategy. I began towering up and looking around on the ground for burrows, yet this yielded no results. That is, until that afternoon, where I towered up and ended up seeing these holes. Assuming they were burrows, I then began to search the area. I continued looking through the next morning, and eventually, I heard a sound. Only I had no idea where it was coming from. So I once again towered up and took another look around. And soon enough, I saw something running in the grass. And it was, in fact, a burrowing owl. Anyways, I ended up with a decent photo. And then I spent a little time with it before heading north towards Turtle Lake. The burrowing owl is one of the most unique owls out there, because, as the name suggests, they go underground to nest, and they're the only owl in North America to do so. But these guys don't make their own burrows. No, they use pre-existing burrows from other animals, and it's rather easy for them to do so, as they are some of the smallest owls in the world. However, this also makes it easy to overlook them, because unfortunately, they are one of Canada's endangered species. These owls also faced a nationwide population decline of 90% back in the 1990s. It's still not entirely known what's causing this decline, but at least today in Canada, due to conservation efforts, it looks like they're getting the attention that they deserve. I headed north out of the grasslands the next morning. As I made my way to Turtle Lake, I ended up passing by the forest from earlier. I then found this river and decided to take it for a while. Only after rowing for a bit, I ended up passing something much cooler. Now, I didn't want to have two separate sand dune wonders, so I thought I would do a mini segment on this park, which is known as the Great Sand Hills, and that's essentially what they are, a large patch of sand dunes in southwestern Saskatchewan. Regardless, I had places to be, so I continued north through the prairie. Only now, I was on the verge of starvation. I knew that if I ran out of hunger, I would be dead. So all I could do was continue north, and hope for the lake. So yeah, I just kept walking. And walking. I walked all throughout the day. That is, until I turned my head to the left and saw water. Yes, I immediately got my fishing rod out and fished through the evening. And since this had to be Turtle Lake, the next morning, having filled my hunger bar, I knew that it was time to do some hunting again. I got in my boat and rowed along the shore, where I had last seen it. But it wasn't here, so I crafted some doors and entered the lake. But before I placed them down, I decided to search by swimming. I cautiously swam around the lake, but I didn't see anything. Well, not until that afternoon. Oh, hello. It came up on me fast, and I didn't want to try and outswim it again. So I quickly swam to the bottom of the lake and placed a door, before then digging down. And yeah, I was in a bit of a panic. But I eventually ended up in an air bubble in the ground. Only when I looked up, I could see it swimming above me. But it's not like I had anywhere I could go. So I tried fishing it for a bit. But still no luck. So instead, I swam up and took a few jabs at it. This ended up being a really good strategy, That is, until it started dealing damage to me. So I decided to just make a swim for it. I eventually got back in my boat and rowed away. Yeah, after that encounter, I decided to play it safe and headed home. This took a few days, as I was pretty far from Reindeer Lake. I did end up stopping by the pillager base on the way back, where I collected some more wood. And on day 63, I put that wood to good use, as I had made it back home. I worked on the roof for most of the day and ended up finishing it. I also made some more campfires for my crops. And the next morning, I placed these campfires. I then crafted and placed some trapdoors, before filling the waterway with, well, water. I finished out the day by working on the cabin interior. And on day 65, I worked on the barn interior. I also made a second floor, and added these stairs. But as I do so, let me go ahead and reveal the next animal on my list, and that is the woodland caribou, which I'll honestly find anywhere around Reindeer Lake, so I won't have to travel far for this one. Anyways, day 66 was another farming day, as I planted everything that I could, before then turning my attention to the second floor of my barn. And on the final day of base work, I worked on the interior, as more and more snow began to pile up. Now, I was told that Mikey from Malone reached out to me for one reason only, and that is because his son Nikolai is a huge fan of the channel. I was also told that when Mikey was surviving in Reindeer Lake, after weeks into the competition, it ended up snowing there. So he made a snowman for his son. So Nikolai, as a thank you for being such a cool fan of the channel, I've made this snowman here in your honor. Look at that. I think he fits in pretty well. After having made an honorary snowman, I then worked on some decorating to finish out the day. It was time for me to find this caribou, and I figured that my best bet would be to head north of here, up near the rockier areas. Now, I was hoping that these guys wouldn't be too hard to find. After all, they're pretty large animals. So I optimistically headed to the top of Reindeer Lake, and from there, I climbed up and over some of the shield. I then headed into this forested area that just so happened to house some coyotes, and that reminded me that I needed to proceed with caution. Only the next day, I found something that was neither hostile nor friendly. Yeah, it was these guys again. And naturally, I tried hitting one this time. And yeah, it hit me right back. I don't really know what I was expecting. Anyways, I knew that these had to be a part of the local folklore. And indeed they were. The Plains Cree told stories of tiny humanoid creatures that roam throughout Saskatchewan. These creatures are called the Memikwesawak, which, by the way, I could not find a pronunciation for. But regardless, reports of these strange people continue to this very day, as they've been seen around Churchill River, Reindeer Lake, and many other locations nearby. We may never know the reality of what they are, or if they're even real, but some people swear by their legendary existence. I left and headed further north, and after a while, I ended up in this large field with some moose. I also saw some more moose fighting nearby, so I went to take a look. And that's when I saw another animal. I thought surely I couldn't have found it so soon. But no, this was certainly the very caribou that I was looking for. So I pulled out my camera and went to take a picture. Only that's when this one decided to start dancing on this azalea. So naturally, I went to take a picture of the other one. And then there was just this moose behind me, watching it all happen. Anyways, that very evening, I saw signs of an impending storm. The storm was pretty rough. I got my camera out and tried to take another picture, but yeah, the one I had taken yesterday was just so much better. So I went to head home. The strong winds made it harder for me to move, but I still headed down towards the lake anyways. And the next day, while the storm was still here, it had died down some. Either way, as I continue south towards my home, let's talk about Saskatchewan's woodland caribou. The woodland caribou is almost exclusively found in Canada, and it's the only species within the deer family where both the males and females can grow antlers. However, these gentle giants are listed as endangered in the United States, and in the forests of Saskatchewan, they are listed as vulnerable. Hunting, disease, and urban development are all to blame for this. But the good news is that a Canadian recovery plan was enacted for the woodland caribou back in 2012. And since then, progress has been made. But there is still a lot of work to be done, as habitat loss for the woodland caribou in Western Canada has only increased. I made it home on day 72 and got right to work on the interior. I also started on the barn doors and made some more campfires, before then finishing the barn doors the next day. I also was able to get Martin upstairs, even though I had to do it by making him mad at me. Angry pine martens aside, I then started a day trip down to the pillager outpost, and fought some spiders that night for the string. Next day, I made it to the outpost, and took a lot of decorations from within it. I also took some more wood, and just spent most of the day tearing it apart. So, while I do all of that, let me reveal the final animal on my list for this video. And that is the prairie rattlesnake, which I will find near the big Muddy Badlands. After making it home the next day, I just worked on the bedroom some, and finished my cabin roof. Now, since the big Muddy Badlands are at the very bottom of Saskatchewan, right above Montana, I decided to once again take Reindeer Lake south, and then head west via the Churchill River. By this point, I was quite familiar with my southern route. So, as I make my way towards the prairie, I wanted to mention something. I plan on covering all of Canada's provinces in the future, and as I do, I want to at least mention the capital of each province. Obviously on this channel, I can't visit modern cities, and unfortunately, Regina, Saskatchewan's capital, falls under that category. However, both Regina and Saskatoon are certainly worth a visit, as the latter has been referred to as the Paris of the Prairies due to its many scenic bridges. Cities aside, I found myself traveling through the forest on day 77, and, like always, it seemed to take up the entire day. But I did find another lake that evening, and upon following it the next morning, I found something unexpected. Before me was a large pathway that cut through the mixed forestry. As it turns out, I was actually in Saskatchewan's Prince Albert National Park. However, my days were becoming limited, meaning I only had so much time to find a rattlesnake. So I used today to craft some more paper, before then continuing on my way south, where I would find a river the next morning. But my Canadian distractions weren't over yet, as the tree line was quite thin on my left, allowing for a glimpse of a church. But of course, you know what channel you're watching. This wasn't just any church. This is the site of the Battle of Batoche. Now, to fully understand the conflict, I must first introduce you to Louis Riel. Not only was he a founder of the Canadian province of Manitoba, but he was the leader of the Métis, a people of both Indigenous and European ancestry, who once held Batoche as one of their most significant settlements. The Métis felt as though the Canadian government had failed to fulfill promises that were made to them in their treaties, such as the protection of their land, and the drastic decline in the population of bison, just as we discussed earlier. However, after much hostility between the Métis and the government, Canadian forces were sent to Batoche to put a final end to it all. And only a few incredibly tense days later, a decisive victory was unveiled. The Canadian militia had overpowered the Métis. As for Louis Riel, well, he would later face the death penalty for his actions. What sits here today is the historic Church of Batoche, quietly overlooking a grassy field. That evening, I spotted a farmhouse. Next morning, I explored the farmhouse, but there wasn't much in here that would be useful to me, except for these barrels in the shed. Anyways, with my mind set on reaching the Badlands, I headed further into the prairie and found this lake that afternoon. I finally reached the Grasslands National Park. It was once again hot, meaning that I had to place water constantly as I went. Soon enough, I came across this patch of forestry, which I then used to make leaf armor. And from there, I continued south. Only this time, a large mesa appeared before me. And that's because I had just reached my final wonder. The Big Muddy Badlands, a scenic remnant of the once Wild West. These badlands stretch across the border of Saskatchewan, dipping into northern Montana. Here, among the wildflowers and cacti, you can find Castle Butte, a towering landmark of the area. In short, the Big Muddy Badlands are a stunning look into an outlaw era of Saskatchewan's history. I walked beside Castle Butte the next morning. I then made my way further into the Big Muddy Valley, where I eventually came across some bison and some other wildlife. However, I had yet to see a rattlesnake, so I continued to look around the area and head a bit further west. And that evening, right as I was considering the towering up method, I found one. I got my camera out and went to take a photo, but I ended up getting way too close to it, as it bit me. But I finally did get a decent picture right as the sun set. And the next morning, I went to try and get another one. After looking at the two photos, I had a pretty clear favorite. And so, with that being said, it was now time for me to make one last trip to Turtle Lake. As I head back towards the Grasslands, let's discuss the final animal of this video. The prairie rattlesnake. Found throughout the southernmost prairies and badlands of Saskatchewan and Alberta, this venomous snake famously vibrates its tail as a warning for those approaching it. But that's the important part. See, these guys aren't necessarily aggressive, but are rather defensive, meaning that if you leave them alone, they'll likely leave you alone. Which is why it's a shame that they are listed as vulnerable across Canada and of special concern in Alberta. This is mostly due to habitat loss, with the main culprit being the development of roads. However, there is at least some legislation protecting these snakes, as the Saskatchewan and Alberta Wildlife Acts prohibit any harm or possession of these guys without a permit. So hopefully you'll be able to hear the rattles of these snakes if you ever visit southern Saskatchewan. Just not too closely. As I now head northwest, I was once again out of food. Funny when my base is a literal farm. Anyways, I actually realized that I could use a little Minecraft quirk to get food. See, if I place my water bucket down, I can fish in this little square of water. So that's just what I did. And no, this option was not available to Mikey when he was surviving in Reindeer Lake. By the way, I did want to mention that Mikey has a YouTube channel. As I mentioned before, he was really helpful with the research of this video, and he's all around just a really great guy. So his channel is linked in the description, in case you want to learn some survival skills. Regardless, I just spent the entire day heading north through the prairie. And the next morning, I once again rode past the Great Sand Hills. From here, I knew that it was just a quick trip north. And thanks to my new fishing hack, I was actually able to reach Turtle Lake that same evening, where I decided to kill a few sturgeon. The next morning, I ate the sturgeon and prepared myself for my final attempt at defeating the Turtle Lake monster. Only this time, I knew that fishing it wasn't going to cut it. So I rode out into the lake and began my search. I plunged into the murky waters and looked around the depths of the lake. But with no sight of the creature, I continued moving around the lake and diving in at different locations. Only that's when I came across my boat from earlier, which meant that it had to be nearby. So I reluctantly dove into the waters and took a look around. But I still saw nothing. So I rowed out a little further and took another look. I swam up to my boat immediately and began to lure the creature to the surface. From here, I jumped in and started fighting. I got in multiple solid hits, but I also had to shield myself from the barrage of attacks. And then the creature began hitting me multiple times in a row, and it didn't stop. I just barely made it to my boat, and I then rode straight to the shore. Yeah, I had almost died once again, but I knew my fight wasn't over, because that evening, I began healing up for what the next day would bring. I rode back out into the middle of the lake, and then headed back into the murky waters, and soon enough, it emerged from the depths. I got right back into my boat, but as soon as it hit me, I knew I had to face it full on. We exchanged many hits, back and forth rapidly, but in a flash, it was gone. I had just barely defeated the Turtle Lake monster of Saskatchewan. Yeah, after all of that, I decided to do some peaceful fishing that evening, in preparation for the last leg of my trip. Over the next few days, I headed home, taking the same route as the times before. So while I rode down the infinite rivers and lakes of Saskatchewan, let me give this province its difficulty rating. Here in Saskatchewan, I had to face the harsh colds, intense heat, and the wildlife. Not only was it hard traveling here, but it was also simply difficult to survive. So that being said, I will have to give Saskatchewan a 7.5 out of 10 in terms of difficulty. I made it home on day 93, and knew that I had some building to do, as base review will be on day 99. After seeing that Martin was waiting to greet me, I got right to work on the barrels. Before then, putting this picture in a proper frame. I finished out the day through some farming, and worked on the cabin the next day, which I now decided was my kitchen. Also added a bit to the exterior, and tried to find furniture, but everything required wool, which I just didn't have. Anyways, on day 95, I worked a lot on the interior of the barn. I also finished the kitchen area for the most part, and worked in these vine walls, before then turning my attention to my room the next day. And yes, it desperately needed my attention. I also added these silos because, well, why not? But on day 97, I focused entirely on the interior, did a lot of wood chopping, and added more to my room. And of course, that brings me to the final day before base review. I spent this day looking through crafting recipes and just adding random decorations. I also looked around and made sure that I was ready for day 99. I woke up and looked around each part of my base, before then giving it a final verdict. Let's start with the kitchen, which is honestly fine. It's not very big and doesn't have a ton of kitchen-y things, but I think the animal heads are pretty cool. Now for the barn interior, and this includes my room. This is probably the weakest part of the base, just because I couldn't add much furniture, so it does seem a little bit bare. But at least the exterior is nice. In fact, I really like this exterior. It feels complete, and just has that nice barn look to it. So with all that taken into account, I give my Saskatchewan base a solid 6.5 out of 10. Not bad, but just not my best work. With that being said, there is still one more day. I woke up on day 100 and took my boat out to the frozen lake. As I flew across the ice, I couldn't help but think about the last 100 days and just what kind of a place Saskatchewan had been. As Canada's 7th largest province, Saskatchewan is easy to overlook, especially when you consider that this province is in between both Alberta and Manitoba, two much more famous provinces with larger populations. But in my opinion, that simply adds to the charm that Saskatchewan has, as where else are you going to find hints of the Wild West, endless expanses of bison roaming grasslands, 2 huge stretches of massive sand dunes, and almost infinite boreal forests, housing some of nature's most regal animals. The truth is, you won't find that anywhere but in Saskatchewan. Now, with all of that being said, thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you all in the next video.